"Ma'am, get up out of that chair and step away from the bed. You don't belong back in this unit." He said it the way certain men say things they have already decided are true, long before the facts get a chance to argue back. There was no question in it, not even the shape of one. It was a verdict wearing the costume of an instruction. I remember the exact hush of the room when the words landed. It was not really silence. It was a low choir of machines, the soft chirp of the monitor keeping time with my mother's heart, the patient sigh of a ventilator 2 beds down rising and falling like the breath of the building itself, the tick of an 4 pump counting droplets in the dark. I remember the smell the way you remember smells from the worst nights of your life. Antiseptic laid over something older and sweeter, and under all of it the cold coffee going stale in a paper cup by my elbow, coffee I had bought at midnight and never drunk, a skin already forming on top of it. I remember my mother's hand inside mine, thin as paper, the skin gone soft and translucent the way skin does at the very end, warm only because I had been holding it for 4 hours and had given it what heat I had left in my own body. And I remember lifting my eyes to the man in the doorway and understanding, in the immediate wordless way you understand weather changing, that he had already written the ending of this story in his head, and that I was only a character in it now, and a minor one at that. What Officer Wade Larkin did not know, what he could not have known as he loomed over me in the low blue light of that intensive care unit at 2 in the morning, a big man filling a doorway, his shadow falling across the blanket and across my mother's sleeping face, was that the exhausted woman in the faded gray cardigan he had decided did not belong there was Renata Vaughn, the mayor of Ridgeport. He never suspected it. Not once. Not for a single second of everything that came next. To him, I was a problem to be solved by removal, a wrong thing to be carried out of a right place, a line item on the night's list of nuisances. He had no idea, standing there with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his jaw set like a man who has already won, that he was about to remove the most powerful elected official in the city out the front door of its largest hospital, in front of a corridor full of witnesses and phones held up in trembling hands, and cost that city $675,000 before the winter sun came up. I did not tell him. That is always the first thing people want to know, the question that arrives before the sympathy does, before they even remember to be sorry about my mother. Why didn't you just say it, Mayor? Why not flash a card, drop the name, watch the whole thing collapse in 3 clean seconds? The honest answer, the one I have stopped being ashamed of, is that I was too tired that night to be a title. Titles are a kind of armor, and I had taken mine off hours before, piece by piece, the way you shed clothes that have grown too heavy to keep standing in. My mother, Corinne Vaughn, was dying. The doctors had told me 12 hours earlier, in that gentle, over-rehearsed way they have, hands folded and voices lowered a careful register, that we were no longer measuring her life in seasons or months, but in hours, maybe a day, and that I should say the things I needed to say, while she could still, somewhere far down beneath the morphine, perhaps hear them. So I had sent my security detail home. I did not want strangers with earpieces standing along the wall of the room where my mother was leaving the world. I did not want the last air she breathed to be official air, thick with radios and protocol. I had folded my blazer over the back of a waiting room chair and unpinned the little enamel lapel pin that said who I was to the city, and I had set it down. And with it, I had set down the entire person Ridgeport needed me to be. What was left in that chair was not a mayor. It was a 54-year-old woman in an old gray cardigan holding her mother's hand. A daughter and nothing else, worn down to the plain wood of herself. So when a man in a uniform stood over me and informed me that I did not belong at my own dying mother's bedside, some stubborn, grieving, unofficial part of me went very still. And it decided that it wanted to see. It wanted to see what this man would do with an ordinary black woman who was not afraid of him, who would not flinch or stammer, who would not perform the small theater of fear that men like him have learned to expect, and, I have come to believe, quietly to need. "I'm her daughter," I said. My voice came out even and low, no tremor in it, and I saw at once that the evenness bothered him more than shouting would have. It landed on him like a thing out of place. I had learned long ago, in rooms far more dangerous than that one, that calm is a language of its own. Some men cannot hear it as anything but insolence. They cannot tell the difference between a woman who is composed and a woman who is defying them, because to them the two have always been the same thing. "This is my mother," I said. Her nurse knows I'm here. I've been here all night. Larkin's jaw worked. A small muscle jumped at the hinge of it. Late 30s, broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck. He had the wound-tight energy of a man 3/4 through a long bad shift who has finally found a thing he can fix with his hands. "We got a report of an unauthorized person in the critical care wing," he said. "You're not on the visitor board. Let's not make this hard." "Then check the board again." I kept my voice soft. "You gentle a spooked animal that could hurt you if it startled. My name is on it. Ask Marisol." Asked the charge nurse. She signed me in herself, hours ago. That was the moment he should have stepped back. I have gone over it 100 times since, in the dark, and it is always the same. There was a door standing open right there. A clean way out. One small act of checking that would have ended everything before it began. That would have cost him nothing but a walk to a desk. He drove straight past it. And watching his face, I understood exactly why. Behind him in the corridor stood the second officer. A younger man. Danny Whitaker, barely a year off probation, I would learn later. In front of that younger man, backing down felt to Wade Larkin like a kind of death. Like being unmade. I have negotiated union contracts across long tables at 3 in the morning. I have stared down developers with more money than the whole east side of Ridgeport. I have sat across from people who wanted my office and would have taken my head to get it. In all those years, I learned to see the exact flicker when a man decides that being right has become less important to him than not being seen to be wrong. I watched that flicker cross Larkin's face like a shadow crossing water. His hand dropped to his belt, not to the weapon. I want to be exact about that, because precision was the only justice I could give the night afterward. Precision was the only weapon I had. His hand dropped to the empty space beside the weapon. The loose, ready posture that says, without a single word, obey me or find out. "On your feet," he said. Now, down the long row of glass-walled rooms, a nurse lifted her head. My mother's monitor kept its slow, patient rhythm, indifferent to all of us, counting out a life that had nothing left to do with this argument. And I understood, fully now, that whatever I said next this man would not hear. He had stopped listening the instant he decided who I was. That decision had taken him, I would say later and mean it precisely, about 4 seconds. I let go of my mother's hand slowly. The way you set down something that will break if you are careless with it. I folded it back onto the blanket where I could still see it. And I stood. Not because he had ordered me to. I stood because I would not allow a struggle to happen inches from her face while she was spending everything she had left on each single breath. If there was going to be ugliness, and I already knew in my bones that there was, it would not happen over her body. Not there. Not that close. I stood with my palms open and turned outward, held a little away from my sides where he could see them plainly. You learn to stand like that when the world spends your whole life teaching you that your calm can be called a weapon and your open hands a threat. "Officer," I said, "I am not resisting anything. I am not going to. I would like your name and your badge number. I would like you to call the charge nurse to this room. And I promise you this will be over in 1 minute. You'll get all that at the desk," Larkin said. He reached out and closed his hand around my arm above the elbow. His fingers tightened. I could feel each one of them separately. 5 distinct points of pressure pressing into the muscle. It did not hurt so much as announce itself. The grip of a man moving an object he has decided is his to move. Marisol Reyes, my mother's night nurse, came around the corner at a half-run. Her blue scrubs were a smear of motion, one hand thrown out ahead of her. She was calling that I was family, that I was on the list, that he had bad information, that he needed to stop and check before he did this. He did not slow by a single step. He turned me toward the door with the flat, impersonal authority of a man rearranging furniture in a room he does not own and never asked about. Danny Whitaker stepped sideways to clear the doorway and let us pass. His eyes were already sliding away from mine, down to the floor, to the wall, to anywhere that was not my face. And I looked back once. One last look, at the small, still shape of my mother under the white blanket, alone now beneath the humming light, her hand where I had left it folded on the cover. And something in me that had held itself together for 4 straight hours cracked. Very quietly. Somewhere down inside where no one in that corridor could see it or use it against me. He walked me out. That is the sanitized, cowardly little word for it. Walked. And I will not pretend it was gentle, because it was not. But I have refused, in every telling sense, to inflate it into something it was not, because the plain truth was damning enough on its own and needed no help from me. He kept his grip locked on my arm and steered me down the critical care corridor at a pace set for his legs and not mine. I stumbled twice in my flat, soft shoes. I caught myself against nothing, against the air, my shoulders swinging out for a wall that wasn't there. We passed the family lounge, where two other people keeping their own night vigils looked up from their own private grief with alarm blooming across their faces. We passed a crash cart parked against the wall, past the wide double doors with their red warning stripe, out into the broader hallway by the elevators, where the fluorescent lights were merciless and white, and there was nowhere at all to hide, nowhere to be small. My cardigan slipped off one shoulder and hung there, and I could not lift it back because he had that arm. A young man near the elevator bank raised his phone. Slowly, the way you raise a camera when part of you cannot quite believe what it is seeing and part of you already knows it must be kept. A woman in a wheelchair by the dark window said, "That's not right." The small, brave voice of a person who is not at all sure anyone will listen, but has decided to say it into the room anyway. Marisol was still behind us, still following, still saying my name into the back of Larkin's head. Without turning, he told her to step back or she would be interfering with an officer. I heard her breath catch at the raw thread in it. "I'm not going to fight you," I told him quietly. I meant it as a mercy for both of us, the last one I had to give away that night. But I want you to remember, later, and there is going to be a later, that I asked you 3 times to check the board. He didn't answer. He walked me to the little security alcove beside the elevators. Set my back against the wall the way you'd park a thing you meant to come back for. Told me to stay put while he decided what to do with me. So I stood there, in front of a dozen strangers. A 54-year-old woman who had been pulled from her dying mother's side. A red mark already blooming up out of the skin of my forearm in the exact shape of a man's fingers. And I did the only thing I have ever truly known how to do when the floor drops out from under me and there is nothing left in the world to hold. I got very, very still, and I began to count. I counted the minutes stacking themselves one on another. I counted the number on the badge pinned to his chest, 4,471, and burned it into the front of my mind. I counted the number on the younger man's, 5093. I counted the small dark dome of the camera in the ceiling. The green exit signs, one at each end of the hall. The ambulance bay beyond the window, where an idling rig turned its lights over and over without any siren, so that the whole corridor washed slowly, silently red, and then blue, and then red again. The very colors of the very department that had just dragged me out of my mother's room, painting the walls around me in rhythm, over and over, like a heartbeat. I cataloged every piece of it, the way I have spent a lifetime cataloging rooms full of people who took one look and decided I was no one. Because I have been underestimated in every room I ever walked into. And I built an entire life, and then an entire career, out of what people do and say when they are certain they are standing in front of nobody who matters. Here is the thing about a man who has made a mistake he cannot yet see the size of. He does not go quiet and careful. He gets loud. He starts building. Whitaker hovered a few feet off. I could see the doubt working in him like a bruise coming up slowly under the skin. He kept glancing from Larkin to me and back again. Then out at the phone screens, tilting quietly toward us all down the length of the hall. Then back to his partner. Each time he looked at me, he looked away faster, as though my face had begun to cost him something. "Wade," he said at last, low, almost under his breath. "Maybe we should just check the—" "I've got it," Larkin snapped. Cut him clean off. And then he did the thing that would, in about 9 hours, take his whole story apart in front of everyone. He started to talk. Out loud. For the record, he thought he was building in his favor. He keyed the radio on his shoulder and asked dispatch to run me for warrants. He asked the security desk, in a flat, clipped voice, who exactly was supposed to be watching the ICU doors tonight, already hunting for someone else to hang it on. He narrated me to the night like a suspect. Combative. Uncooperative. Refusing lawful orders. He said each of those words into a hallway strung end to end with cameras, and he did not once look up at the little dark dome in the ceiling, or at the phones, or at the body camera riding his own partner's chest. He thought he was writing his defense. He was signing a confession, one clean sentence at a time. At one point he half turned to his partner and said, low, that they were fine, that this was nothing, that people like this always talked big and never followed through. He said it like a man patting his own pocket to feel the wallet still there. Whitaker did not answer him. Whitaker was looking at the phones. And then he reached for the thing that would damn him most of all. He asked dispatch how to write me up. Not to release me, to charge me. Criminal trespass. He wanted a citation with my name on it. A piece of paper that would make the woman he had dragged out of the room the offender and himself the officer who had handled it by the book. He wanted it in the system before sunrise, because a charge on the record is a very hard thing to walk back, and Wade Larkin understood that much about the machine he served even if he understood nothing else that night. He was, at that moment, one signature away from turning his mistake into my crime. He never got the signature, but he asked for it, out loud, on the radio, while 6 cameras watched him ask. A mistake is a thing you make once. What he did instead, again and again, for hours, was choose it. Because, and this is the part he could not have known, the part that makes me almost pity him some nights, his own camera was off. He had never switched it on. Not in the room, not in the corridor, not at the grab. And I have come to believe that this was the whole engine of his confidence. In his head, it was already his word against a tired, mouthy woman's. And he had a badge and a partner and 30 years of the department's habits behind his word. He did not know about the ceiling. He did not know about the phones. And he most certainly did not know that Danny Whitaker's camera had been running, unblinking, from the doorway of my mother's room all the way to this wall, catching every word he was now so carefully feeding into the record. The elevator behind him chimed and slid open. The charge nurse stepped out first, a clipboard held flat against her chest. And behind her, breathless, in yesterday's shirt and the wrong shoes and no coat against the winter, came my chief of staff, Terrence Boyd. Marisol Reyes had thought, God bless her forever, to call him the instant Larkin's back was turned in that room. Terrence stopped dead when he saw me against the wall. I watched him take the whole picture in at a single glance. The way a photograph develops all at once out of nothing. The uniformed officer, the grip marks rising red on my arm, the raised phones, the slipped shoulder of my cardigan, the sheer howling wrongness of me standing there like that. And I watched 20 years of loyalty and 20 years of banked fury arrive on his face together in one held breath. He did not shout. Terrence never shouts. That steadiness is exactly why I hired him and exactly why I have kept him at my side through everything since. He crossed straight to the charge nurse, bent his head close to hers, said 6 words, quietly. I saw her glance down at the clipboard against her chest, then lift her eyes, and settle them on Officer Wade Larkin with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Officer, she said. She pitched it to Carrie. It reached down the whole length of that corridor and turned heads. Do you know who you just removed from that unit? Larkin's radio still crackled faintly against his shoulder. Dispatch's voice threading thin under the moment. A visitor, he said, who wasn't on her name is on my board. The charge nurse took one deliberate step forward. It has been on my board since 11 o'clock tonight. That is Mayor Renata Vaughn. That is the mayor of this city. And the patient in bed is her mother. Her mother is actively dying. Right now? Tonight. And you just pulled her daughter out of the room by the arm. I have spent a long time in public life. I have stood in front of a great many people at the exact moment they received news they were in no way ready to receive. Layoffs, defeats, diagnoses read straight off a page in a small quiet room. I had never, in all of it, seen a human face do what Wade Larkin's face did in that hallway. The color did not drain out of it the slow way blood leaves a face. It fell out of it all at once. From the top down. The way dry sand runs out of a bag the moment the scene gives way. He turned his head and looked at me. Really looked. For the first time in the entire encounter. At the old gray cardigan. The soft flat shoes. The tired lined eyes he had glanced at once in a doorway and decided told him everything he needed to know. I could see him searching all of it now, frantically, for the mayor, for some sign of her, and not finding her anywhere. Because the mayor had never been the point. The point had always, only, been what he had assumed I was. His mouth came open. Nothing came out of it at all. Terrence took a single step toward him. I lifted one hand from my side. Just an inch. Just barely. My chief of staff stopped where he stood. We have worked together long enough that he knew the small gesture meant not like this. Not for me. Not tonight. Not over her. Officer Larkin, I said. My voice did not shake, which surprised even me. You can let go of the idea that I am going to make a scene. I don't want a scene. I have no use for one. What I want is to go back into that room and sit with my mother. I turned to the charge nurse. Is she stable? Did anything change while I was out here? She's the same, Marisol said from behind me, close now. When I glanced back, her eyes were shining wet in the white light. She's the same, Mayor. Nothing changed. Go back into her. Now. But Larkin had found his voice. It came out of him in exactly the wrong shape. All reflex and self-protection. A drowning man's voice reaching for anything that would float. I was responding to a call, he said. Too fast. The words tumbling. I had a report of an unauthorized person. You had a report, I said. And you did not check it. I asked you to check it 3 separate times. I let that hang in the hallway. Let everyone standing there hear the whole shape of it settle. I'm going to go and sit with my mother now. You are going to stand right there where you are. And I want you to understand one thing, because it is the only thing I am going to ask you to carry out of tonight. Whatever happens after this is not going to be about you and me. Do you hear me? It is going to be about a system that let you decide, in 4 seconds, standing in a doorway, that a woman at her own mother's deathbed was a criminal because of the way she looked to you. That is the thing I am going to spend my office fixing. Not you. That. I did not wait for him to answer. I turned and walked back through the double doors on my own 2 feet. Unescorted, past Danny Whitaker, who stepped aside and could not lift his eyes to meet mine. Down the row of glass rooms. Back into hers. I sat down in the same chair I had been dragged out of. I took my mother's paper-thin hand up into both of mine again. I lowered my head down onto the pillow beside hers, close to her ear, close enough to smell her hair. And there, at last, out of the sight of every uniform and every raised phone and every citizen who had ever cast a vote for me, the mayor of Ridgeport put her face down next to her mother's and wept. My mother did not wake again. She died at 40 minutes past 6 that morning, with the first of the winter light just beginning to gray the window from black to the color of ash. I was holding both of her hands in both of mine when she went. Marisol was on the far side of the bed with her palm laid flat and gentle on my mother's forehead, the way you soothe a child down into sleep. There was not a single officer in the room, because I had spent the last 4 hours of my mother's life not at war with the man who had wronged me, but simply, stubbornly, refusing to let him take 1 more minute of her from me than he already had. That, in the end, is the decision I am proudest of out of all of them. Not the settlement that came later. Not the reforms with my name on them, the ones the newspapers wrote about. It is that when everything came down to the one thing in this world that could never be replaced or refunded or rebuilt, the last of her, the final hour of my mother on the earth, I did not spend it on anger. I did not let him have it. I have made harder political choices in my life. I have never made a better human one, and I do not expect that I ever will. By the time I walked out through the sliding doors into the cold gray morning, my breath clouding in front of me, I already knew a second thing was coming, whether I reached for it or not. Because I had watched something in that corridor that was larger than my mother and larger than me and larger than one bad officer on one bad night. I had watched a man do to me, to a person with more power than nearly anyone else inside that entire building. The precise thing he had, I felt certain, done 100 times before to people who had none of it. The only real difference between me and every one of them was a chief of staff who could reach that hospital in 8 minutes and a name on a nurse's board that could make a whole room change temperature. That thin, arbitrary, unearned difference is the entire disease, laid bare. And Ridgeport, God help it, tried to look away from it anyway. The department's very first move was the oldest one there is. The reflex of every institution ever caught with its hand where it shouldn't be. Get out ahead of it with a paper version of events. Before I had so much as chosen an urn for my mother's ashes, a statement went out under the letterhead of the police union. A tense but entirely by-the-numbers encounter, it said. An uncooperative individual in a restricted medical area. Resolved, in their chosen phrase, without incident. Uncooperative. Resolved without incident. I read it standing in my own kitchen, still in my funeral clothes, a cup of tea going cold in my hand exactly the way the coffee had gone cold hours before. And I laughed. One short sound. Nothing warm anywhere in it. Because the audacity of it was very nearly a kind of art. A small, ugly masterpiece of institutional nerve. But here is what the union did not know when it put those words on paper. Here is what Wade Larkin did not know when he gave them his account, sitting in some back room with his elbows on his knees, certain it was his word and a badge against a mouthy woman and a rattled rookie. He kept talking, just like he had in the corridor. He could not stop building. I have seen the statement he gave. Every line of it. And every line of it is a small trap he set for himself, tripped by a camera he did not know was watching. He wrote that I refused repeated lawful orders to leave. The board would show my name signed in at 11 o'clock. The tape would show me asking him, 3 times, in a voice you could set a metronome to, "Please check the board." He wrote that I was combative and had to be physically guided out for the safety of the unit. 6 angles of footage would show a 54-year-old woman in a cardigan standing with her palms open and turned out, telling him, plainly, "I am not resisting anything. I am not going to." He wrote that no undue force was used. The photograph the hospital took of my forearm at 6 that morning would show 5 finger marks risen up out of the skin like a brand. He wrote that the patient's care was never disturbed. My mother died 4 hours later without waking, and I will go to my own grave unsure whether some part of her, down beneath the morphine, heard the man's voice rise over the sound of her own failing heart and knew her daughter was being taken from the room. That line of his I cannot forgive, and I have stopped trying to. He wrote that the removal was necessary and unavoidable. And every person who had stood in that corridor, the man with the phone, the woman in the wheelchair, the 2 families in the lounge, the night nurse who ran the whole length of it saying my name, would say, on the record, that a single walk to a desk would have ended it. Every sentence he wrote to save himself was a sentence the truth had already gotten to first. And still he dug. In the hours after, before the video surfaced, I am told he went looking for his partner. He found young Danny Whitaker in the locker room and did what men like Larkin always do to the rookie who saw too much. He began, gently at first, and then less gently, to help the boy remember the night the useful way. She'd been aggressive. She'd pulled away from the grip. It had gotten heated, hadn't it, before they got her to the wall. He was not asking Whitaker to lie, exactly. He was inviting him to agree that a lie was only a rounding error. What Wade Larkin did not know, what he had somehow never registered in a full night of building his defense out loud, was that the answer to every one of those leading questions was already recorded on the camera strapped to Danny Whitaker's own chest. The rookie did not have to decide whether to be brave. The truth had been riding on his body the entire time, and it did not care which way his nerve broke. It had already remembered the night correctly, in color, with sound, and it was not going to unremember it for anyone. And the department, not yet knowing what was coming, kept doubling the bet. 2 days after the funeral, the union president sat down in front of a local news camera in a pressed shirt and said it all again, with feeling. His officer had followed protocol. The individual had been uncooperative. It was unfortunate that a family member had been involved, but the unit's security was the priority, and the matter had been handled appropriately and closed. He said appropriately and closed on live television. He said it into the same city whose phones were already full of the footage that would make a liar of every word. He thought he was ending the story. He was setting the match to it. The truth, as it happened, was on video from 6 directions at once. The hospital's own ceiling cameras had it. The corridor, the alcove, every step. 3 separate patients' families had it on their phones, from 3 separate angles, sound and all. And then there was the 6th camera, the one that took the careful fiction apart at the seams. Officer Danny Whitaker's body camera had been running the entire time, from the doorway of my mother's room to the elevators and beyond. Larkin's own camera he had never switched on until we were already standing at the elevator bank, the single most expensive 4 minutes of forgetting in the history of that department. Whitaker's had caught all of it. It caught me saying, twice, clearly, that I was her daughter. It caught me asking, in that same even voice, "Please check the board." It caught the charge nurse's voice, 20 feet down the hall, saying my name and my title so plainly you could make out every word of it over the hum of the machines. The union had signed its name to resolved without incident, and the incident had been recorded, in full, 6 times over, by the very night the union was trying to erase. I am told that when Internal Affairs sat Wade Larkin down, he gave them the same account a 3rd time. Same words, same confidence, combative, uncooperative, unavoidable. He had told the story so many times by then that he may have started to believe it himself, which is the last mercy the mind gives a man before the tape rolls. Then they rolled the tape, all 6 angles of it. And I am told that somewhere around the 3rd camera, the one strapped to his own partner's chest. Wade Larkin stopped talking and did not start again. When the city attorney, Harold Finch, telephoned me that afternoon to walk me carefully through what he called our options, I stopped him before he was well started. I told him I did not want a war. I told him I wanted a mirror. I wanted the city made to see itself exactly as it was, in full, with nothing softened. And then I wanted us to set about becoming something worth the looking. It would have been easy to burn him. I want to be honest about that, because the ease of it was its own kind of temptation. I had all of it, 6 angles of footage, the grief still raw on my face, the office and the podium and the microphones that would come running the instant I called. I could have stood up the morning after the funeral and demanded the man's badge on live television, and not one soul in Ridgeport would have blamed me for a second of it. I did not do it, and the reason was my mother. Corinne Vaughn cleaned other people's offices for 30 years, emptied their wastebaskets, wiped down their conference tables, rode the last bus home in the dark with her feet aching, so that her daughter could sit in a law school lecture hall. And the thing she said to me most often across all those years, so often it stopped being advice and became the background sound of the house I grew up in, was this: don't you let them make you small, and don't you let getting even make you small either. Getting even, she'd say, is just the small thing dressed up in the big thing's clothes. So I chose the harder road, and I began it with a room instead of a podium. I asked Chief Raymond Doyle into my office. Door shut. No cameras, no evening broadcast. I told him what I had seen and, harder, what I had felt. I told him I had already pulled Larkin's file and read it twice. 2 prior complaints, both out of the parts of Ridgeport where no one's chief of staff ever arrives in 8 minutes. Both closed as unfounded, and both looking now, in the cold light of my own corridor, like exactly what they had always been. I told him I did not want to fire one man and call it a day's work. A monster is a thing you fire and forget and feel clean about. A pattern is a thing you actually have to fix. The settlement took the shape everyone expected and none of them saw coming. The insurers and the council, staring down what any jury alive would do with that footage, arrived at a number fast, and with almost no argument, $675,000. Everyone in the room assumed the only question left was whether I would take it. I let them assume it right up until the figure was down on paper and agreed. Then I told them I would not keep a single dollar. I was giving all of it back to the city that had wronged me, only this time aimed straight at the wound, instead of at the walls. More than half of it, $350,000, became the Corinne Vaughn Family Presence Fund, seated inside Ridgeport's public hospitals, so that no family keeping a bedside vigil would ever again be treated as a trespasser during the worst hours of their lives. It pays, to this day, for around-the-clock family liaisons on the intensive care floors, people whose only job is to know exactly who belongs at which bed, and to stand, bodily if it comes to it, between a grieving daughter and a catastrophic mistake. $150,000 went to the department, but with strings I tied myself, not by knot. Real training run with real nurses and physicians in the room, and one bright-line rule written into policy with my mother's own case number at the top of the page. No officer removes anyone from a patient care area until the charge nurse has confirmed the facts out loud, and the camera stays on from the first word. The rest seated an independent civilian review panel with genuine subpoena power to hear the complaints coming up out of the neighborhoods where complaints had been quietly going to die for years. None of it happened in weeks. The investigation ran its months. Marisol Reyes, the nurse who ran that corridor and would not stop saying my name. I named to the hospital's board over her own furious blushing, and she now helps run the family presence program she once tried to be for me with her own 2 hands. Danny Whitaker, whose camera told the truth his partner tried to bury, is on the training team. He tells the story of my mother's ICU to every new class of recruits, from the inside, as the man who almost said something sooner and has decided never to almost say something again. And Wade Larkin was not fired. That was my choice, and I fought for it against a loud chorus of my own allies who wanted his head on the wall. He was suspended. He was disciplined, formally and on the record. He was stripped of the quiet protections that had buried his 2 earlier complaints. And he was assigned, for a part of every week, to a detail inside the very hospital he had dragged me out of: de-escalation, family crisis, learning that building, and every kind of person who walks through its doors as human beings and not as reports to be closed. Not because I had forgiven him, Because firing one man and calling it justice is exactly how cities have gone on avoiding fixing themselves for 100 years. He came to see me once, months later, unannounced. Stood in the middle of my office in almost the same posture he'd stood in that doorway at 2 in the morning. Except all the certainty had drained out of him and left something quieter and much older in its place. He told me he'd read my mother's obituary. More than once. The 30 years of cleaning offices, the law school it paid for, the last bus home in the dark. "I don't have a speech about you," he said, and his voice was not steady. "I just wanted to come and say that I saw her." He meant my mother. He meant, far too late to change a single thing me. It was not enough. Nothing is ever going to be enough, when the price was the last minutes of my mother's life. But it was not nothing either. The room opened on a bright, hard cold afternoon almost a year on, and I went back to Ridgeport General. Not stripped down to a daughter in a gray cardigan this time, but as the mayor, the blazer on, the enamel pinned back on my collar, my detail at the doors, the whole armored weight of the office I had set down that night carried openly back into the building that had thrown me out of it. Same hospital, same 4th floor. A short walk from the critical care wing where a man had once decided in 4 seconds that I was no one. They had built a small room there. Soft warm light. Deep chairs, a wide window that catches the whole of the afternoon sun. It is where families sit now, through the longest hours of their lives, with a liaison who knows their names and knows the number of the bed and will not let anyone come to move them. Beside the door there is a brass plate, my mother's name across the top, and under it, one line, the line she used to say with her hand on a mop, "Don't let getting even make you small." I stood in that doorway, a doorway, of all things, and I watched a liaison walk a young man down the corridor toward the room, her hand light at his elbow, guiding him in, not out. And at the far end of the same hall, on his hospital detail, in uniform, Wade Larkin had stopped in front of the brass plate. He did not know I was there. He stood reading my mother's name and my mother's words, the way I am told he stops and reads them most shifts he works. Then he stepped back to let the young man and his liaison pass. And he held the door. That is the picture I keep. Not the grip on my arm. That one. The man who once dragged a daughter out of that unit, standing quietly in the same corridor, holding the door open for the next one. Revenge feels exactly like power, and it is the smallest thing there is. My mother told me that with a mop in her hand, years before I believed her. I did not want to win. Winning would have ended with one man gone and everything else exactly as it was. I wanted to change the 4 seconds, and the plate is on the wall, and the door is being held.